Hello adventurers, I am the Welsh DM, the one Welshman whose accent was left behind by their character in a dungeon. This video I want to discuss a way about building and running dungeons that I think is going to be the way that I run them going forward, especially for those kind of one-shots or side quests for a longer campaign. And that's the premise of a procedurally generated dungeon. What do I mean by a procedurally generated dungeon? Well, I mean a dungeon that isn't mapped out ahead of time during session prep, but instead takes shape and is formed during the session by the decisions the characters make and the random choices of a dice roll, essentially. This takes inspiration from roguelike games like Hades or Splunky, where every time you start playing that game, the encounters that you go through, the rooms that you encounter, are different every time, and you're never able to predetermine what you're going to face in the next room. And the reason I think this is a good idea is that it becomes a lot less prep for a GM ahead of time and avoids the often common mistake of dungeon makers and GMs where the dungeon ends up feeling linear even if it's not mapped out as such, because the GM has a preconceived notion of the direction that the players are going to take and the story that they're trying to tell. This isn't to say that method of creating a dungeon is bad. It's great for adventure writing where you want to make sure that the narrative feeds in a certain way. But when you're running a kind of a one-shot or a fun session that's more focused on just what the characters are doing and the monsters they're fighting, it's a lot of prep time that goes into constructing a dungeon that feels natural and logical and not boring, that can probably be spent better doing other things ahead of the session. So what does this look like in practice? Well, the way that I ran it recently for Unrolled Stories was I prepped up a bunch of rooms, encounters, traps, narrative moments that the players could encounter in the dungeon ahead of time. I split them into categories and stuck them on a random table that every time the players entered into a new room, I got a player to roll on that table. So how it worked was someone rolled a d6 to decide what type of room it was. Was it an encounter room? Was it a trap? Or was it a piece of narrative that they got to investigate and explore? And then from there, they rolled on another table that determined exactly what was in that room. What kind of encounter? Was it blister coil weirds? Or was it a trap room where there was sparks coming from loose wiring in the ceiling? And then aside from that, have a progression corridor table that's more focused on the branching paths of a dungeon rather than the individual rooms. Does this corridor have 2 options to turn into, 3 with a crossroads, or potentially other ways that you can connect up the rooms? It's providing that connective tissue to the dungeon that the characters have to explore through. What this allows you as a GM to do is do the fun part of dungeon prep. You get to do the encounter design, the trap design, the narrative element that's tying all of these things together without having to worry that you're creating an interesting dungeon to explore. Don't get me wrong, there's a risk with a random dungeon that it all feels a bit disconnected and illogical, but I think you're better off leaning into the fun parts of a dungeon, those rooms, the treasure, the monsters that the players are fighting, than worrying about whether room 2 is the correct thing to move on to after room 1, and whether you should have a branching path here or there or on the next floor. This concept is focused on making sure that the dungeon prep is easier for the GM, while still providing an interesting and compelling dungeon for the players to work their way through. I think the really fun element of this is it harkens back to the old days of D&D, where the party would have someone who was sketching out the map as they went through the dungeon, as they pieced everything together. Because at the end of things, you get a memento of what this random procedurally generated dungeon actually was that you went through. I think the important thing to remember when you are writing out your rooms and tables is to make sure that they all still connect to the purpose or the reason for this dungeon existing. I ran this concept recently in Unrolled Stories, and the narrative was a broken down magical metal refinery where the spirits of those who were trapped in it had formed with the dangerous toxic chemicals and created weird elementals, as well as broken machinery that had turned essentially into traps. What this meant was that every room felt connected and they were all part of the same story, but it didn't feel like I was predetermining how that story laid out to the players and instead came to them in a arbitrary way, because ultimately this wasn't designed to be a dungeon by a dungeon maker, it was a factory that had fallen into disrepair, so it didn't really follow the usual dungeon rules. I'm not proposing you use this method for literally every dungeon or sort of dungeon in your campaign, but it's great for those ones where you're trying to tell a more self-contained narrative that is a side quest or a minor distraction for the party, where you don't want to put all of your effort into it because you want to put effort into the main story campaign that they're still going through. As I've said, I like this system. I wouldn't be doing this video if I didn't think so, but there's 3 main reasons why I think that. The first of which is what I've mentioned already in this video, is that it shaves off prep time for the GM. I find myself constantly overthinking dungeon design when I'm doing that for session prep, and it gets in the way of the fun things that I'm trying to build and engage my players with, and ultimately it very rarely matters when it comes to the session. I don't think players are overthinking about the layout of a dungeon when they're going through it. So why should you as the GM worry about it too much either? Secondly, in a similar way, it removes that unconscious bias. I know when I've been making dungeons that I often end up accidentally making them linear because I have an expected path that I want the players to take, even subconsciously. What this means is that even though maybe I've mapped out this wide, broad dungeon, the players only explore 10% of it because I've inadvertently made the path through too obvious. There is no reason to explore. With a random dungeon and branching pathways, they don't really have an understanding of where they're going or what they're trying to do. Maybe they can through certain elements, but it means that they're almost forced to explore the dungeon rather than having the dungeon tell them where to go. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, and the reason why I think this is great, is it gives you control over the length of the dungeon in the session. How many times have you written a dungeon and found that it's become a slog because there's just too many rooms and the encounters are taking too long and the players get bored of this dungeon crawl and want to go back to what they were doing beforehand? Or alternatively, how many times have you written one that's too short, that takes no time at all and the characters breeze through it because their encounter powers are too strong and the final boss is too easy? With this method, you can decide when the dungeon ends. You don't have to predetermine the number of rooms because ultimately you have a whole smorgasbord of them on a randomized table. Your players can keep rolling as long as they're having fun. The moment you see the players starting to think, this is going a bit long, or I really want to go fight the boss, or I really want to get the final treasure, that's when you pull out the final encounter. And I recommend having that final encounter as a separate thing off the randomized table so that you can put it in front of your players whenever you need to bring the dungeon to its climax. This flexibility to dungeon design allows us to keep the dungeon fun, and ultimately that is why we play these games. We're not here to slog through a dungeon, we're here to have fun with our friends and enjoy a good time at the table, fighting monsters, telling stories, and interacting with each other as fictional characters. Where I think this kind of dungeon design will really excel is in a system like Daggerheart. Based on my experience during the playtest, this system prefers an adventure to be fairly malleable and not fully formed at the point the session starts. The actions of the players, the rolls of their die shape the adventure, shape what is happening and what challenges they face. So having a dungeon that isn't fully prepared, isn't fully set out, and is more an ephemeral concept, but you have things to pull out whenever you need to, whenever they enter a new room, gives you an incredible amount of flexibility to react to the actions of the players and the whim of the dice, while also not over-preparing and being forced to change things on the fly because the dice have told you so. All I'm saying is, Spencer Stark, give me a call for when you're designing dungeons for the first Daggerheart release. And one final idea for this dungeon is actually play D&D like a roguelike. Let me tell you where I'm going with this. There are groups out there that play D&D the old way. All they want to do is run a dungeon, fight some monsters, get some treasure, and go back to town, and rinse and repeat. They're not here for grand narratives, they're here for fun, rolling some dice, and having a good time. They don't want to overthink, they just want to hit things. And that's fine, that's a great way to play D&D, it's a really relaxing way to play D&D. But as a GM, you've got to constantly prep dungeons for them, and that can take time, or you've got to find them on sources like DM's Guild or other places. With this method, all you've got to do is design rooms. And you can do that when you're sitting at your desk in work, in the shower, whenever you're thinking about D&D, you can design a room, you can design a trap. And what this allows you to do is have the same characters return to the same dungeon over and over again, and it will never become repetitive because the nature of dice rolls. It will allow a adventuring party to stay in the same location and have their basic fun while continuing to experience new and interesting things that happen in their dungeon. Now, obviously there are some people that are going to say, well, that doesn't make any sense. A dungeon is made, it's physical, once you've entered it once, it's mapped out, and why would it change? Well, there's a number of reasons that can happen. Maybe there's a beholder in the dungeon and the dungeon shifts its shape based on the dreams of that beholder every night. Maybe there's a transmutation mage at the bottom of it that constantly shifts around their dungeon, never quite happy with how it's designed. That wizard could be looking to perfect their dungeon, and so are constantly adapting, changing, moving things around based on the actions of the adventurers, learning from them every time they go through to make it harder and harder the next time they turn up. Or maybe the dungeon is just touched by the chaotic plane of limbo and is forced to reshape itself constantly all of the time and is never settled and permanent in place. There are a number of reasons that a dungeon might change its form. I mean, you're in a magical world, there's plenty of madness and weirdness to go around. In fact, if you can think of a fun reason why a dungeon might constantly change every day, leave a comment below and let people know how to design their dungeons. Anyway, that is it. A short video from me, just because I wanted to share the concept of a procedurally generated dungeon with you all. I hope you take this away and start using it in your games, if not every dungeon, but at least the next session, just to see what it's like for you and your players. If you do use this in your next session, leave a comment below, let us know how it went. Did you enjoy it? Did your players enjoy it? Did you find any issues that perhaps other people need to be made aware of? Let's have a discussion and improve this concept for future years. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, do please give it a like, and if you're enjoying everything else I do on the channel, maybe subscribe and hit the bell notification icon to make sure you catch every video that I post up when I do. If you're interested in seeing how this system works, you can check out Unrolled Stories, the actual play campaign on this channel where we did this in a fairly recent episode, so you can see the kind of stories and dungeons you can tell with this method. Anyway, I do believe that's it. That's everything I had to say on dungeon design. So, until we do this again, you keep an eye out for dragons. I'm going to head back into that dungeon and hopefully find my accent, and I will see you next time.